As the sun went down on the arrests at Liliesleaf, the prisoners were shuffling to their cells.
Governor Mbeki said, "This is high treason, chaps."
They took us to the fort in Joburg. By this time it was dark. It was a cold winter's day, July, and we're in the courtyard, and I looked over the battlements, you know, the old battlements of the fort, and I thought, I'm not going to see the night sky for a long time. One of the cops said, "You'll never escape, Dennis. No use looking how you're going to get over the wall. And we want you to run, because then we can shoot you."
Governor Baker, Sasulu, myself, we were put in the, at the fort, there were death cells. There were no executions in Johannesburg, but when a prisoner was sentenced to death, before they were transferred to Pretoria for hanging, there were death cells. So they put us individually in these death cells. And then, of course, from the word go, they started drumming into our heads, "You are going to hang."
The apartheid government had to respond, and it responded with the 90-day law. You could be held in prison for 90 days. Sole access was by the security police. No family, no friends, no lawyers. And this was a license to torture.
The next morning, before we even washed, they came and took photographs. Hence you'll see photographs of us unwashed and looking wild, as they wanted to portray us. These were wild terrorists.
The Goldreich children were also waking up to bleak reality. The father and mother of Paul Goldreich were in Marshall Square police cells in downtown Johannesburg.
My brother and I really didn't have a very clear idea of whether we would ever see him again, or quite what would happen, what would happen in the trajectory of our lives. We were on this, staying in a flat in the centre of Johannesburg. Everything that we knew here, all our belongings, absolutely everything had been taken. So we had nothing.
Inside the fort in Johannesburg, Ahmed Kathrada and his comrades suffered more pressure.
Exercise meant just walking around in single file. And somebody whispered to Governor Mbeki that Luke Smart and Goodley has been tortured to death. Now, of course, this whispering passed on to us. So you have tremendous sleepless nights, because in your mind is, you are going to die. Should I talk? Should I give them the information? Then I'm free. Governor Mbeki's hair turns white. So you have more sleepless nights. What has happened? Because you've come with a belief that under stress people either lose their hair or their hair turns white. So you have more sleepless nights, and you can't ask these chaps. But in jail, as it happens, you get those few minutes, and after sleepless nights, you confront Govan. What has happened? Have you broken down? Have they tortured you? Have you spoken? Have you told them anything about me and about others? He put us at ease. He says, nothing of the sort. My black hair dye has worn off, and I can't replenish it.
In downtown Johannesburg, the families of Arthur Goldreich and Harold Wolpe were trying to spring them from Marshall Square. Their contact on the outside, Anne-Marie Wolpe, tried to smuggle in wire cutters with lunch.
The clippers that I get have red legs sticking out of them, and I put them in a chicken.
Hazel Goldreich, the wife of Arthur and the mother of Paul, was in solitary confinement.
The only people who occupied that cell were murderers or people who were deranged. And that was my cell for the next 3 months. It was painted black.
And I remember on one occasion when they gave us access to my mother at Marshall Square, we arrived at the prison and she wasn't there. And that was a terrible experience, absolutely terrible. Where they'd taken her, I don't know. But this was apparently a planned visit to the prison. But I think you know, they used whatever they could to intimidate and to punish, really, the special branch. And I think this was this was a trick that they pulled on us.
In the end, the prisoners found their own way out. Along with fellow inmates, they bribed teenage policeman Johan Greef. Now he runs an auto repair business in Postmasburg in the Northern Cape. In 1963, he was a young policeman working at Marshall Square and dreaming of buying a fast car. The prisoners offered money, he offered the keys.
They were ordinary people. You know, there wasn't something like guerrillas, or you couldn't see that they were breedaardig. I don't know what you call it in English. Sort of monsters, something like that. They were ordinary people, civilized people.
Greef unlocked it. Arthur was going to hit him on the head. Greef said, "Don't worry, I'll bash my head on the wall and knock myself out."
They were banging on the doors and slamming and shouting, and then I realized Arthur had escaped, and they said to me, "Where has he gone?" "I don't know, I've been asleep, you know, I don't know what's happened." And well, they arrested the young warder, Greef, and put him into Arthur's cell. And the next morning, when I came out into this quadrangle, he was at the window upstairs, and he did a thumbs up. They've escaped.
The newspaper headlines said it all. They were two of our biggest fish.
They got to Swaziland, and apparently they were in this Christian, an Anglican group, and they dressed as priests and flew to Botswana. At once the news broke that they were there. You can imagine the special branch and the army were going to make every attempt to get them.
Journalists like Alf Kumwalo hit the rocky road to Francistown in northern Botswana to follow the scoop.
We drove the whole night along the route. It was a sandy road. The road was very bad. It was just all sand. And we killed about 7 rabbits. And there were lions as well, just sleeping on the road. And lions, cattle. We killed a buck. But we collected those things. And my colleague was screaming that as I stopped to take the animals, the lions will grab me. I remember sending Muchari open the door to peep, just on the side of He said, "I'm not taking any chance. I'm not like you."
Alistair Sparks, then a political correspondent at the Rand Daily Mail in Johannesburg, was also on his way by air.
Francistown was really a one-horse town in those days. It's grown into quite a major settlement, quite a major city now, but it certainly wasn't then. It had one rather derelict hotel called the Central Hotel, an ancient place, and the only airfield anywhere near was the Wenella airfield, which was used by the mining industry to pick up recruited labour and fly them in. And we came circling down to land on this, and there were a herd of elephants on the runway.
Meanwhile, Goldreich and Walpe were worried enough to check into Francistown prison for safety. This was a morale-boosting game of cricket with the warders before the press. But behind the brave face and the crack of leather on willow, there was fear.
Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, had sent a Dakota, an East African Airways Dakota, to Francistown to collect them, and it had landed at Wenella. Came round the corner, and there was a pile of ashes. The aircraft had been burnt on the ground.
This is the wreck of an East African Airways passenger Dakota liner, just been burnt out at Francistown in Bechuanaland. It is the liner which was to have been used to help the escape of 2 of the most sought-after South African whites.
obviously South African security agents had been active and had got there. I realized they were probably staying in the same hotel as I was because there was nowhere else for them to stay.
They were scared that they can be killed.
They were in a high state of anxiety, to put it mildly, because it was obvious that there were ruthless people around in the neighborhood and they were going to be hauled back.
They were panicking. They were worried. They were worried guys. They didn't talk a lot. Yeah, they were really worried.
They were on the phone a lot. They were using the phone in the prison, and they were phoning through, presumably to Tanzania. And eventually they came back and announced, this was after a couple of days, they announced with some relief that another plane was coming, that Nyerere had sent a smaller plane, and it would be arriving the following day. Anyway, I went around early to the prison to see them, say goodbye, do the final story, and they were there in despair again because this plane had crashed.
Then finally, one morning,
I saw the jailer and he said, "Oh, the birds have flown." He said, another plane arrived and we got a message late and they were driven down to Pailapi, which was, I suppose about 150 kilometers to the south. They went down there early morning. President Nyerere managed to get another plane through, and they went down and they waved a big bed sheet out in an open space, and the plane came down and landed and picked them up and took off again.
Arthur Goldreich and Harold Wolpe made it to Tanzania and on to London, where, dressed in sharp suits and stripped of their citizenship, they got down to the job of winning over the hearts and minds of the world.
We were going to set apartheid South Africa ablaze so we could build something new.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
Liliesleaf. In the 1960s, this was a hiding place for many of South Africa's most wanted men. The front was the image of a working farm. It worked for a while until too many people knew its real role as a gathering place for activists, including Nelson Mandela.
Achieved our freedom.
It was also one of the places where the idea of the armed struggle was born.
Will be an empty shell.
It saw the arrest of most of the Rivonia Triallists, leading to the trial of the century, a trial that captivated the world and saw life imprisonment for Nelson Mandela. Nearly half a century on, it's hard to believe that secret meetings on how to overthrow the state were held in this humble thatched cottage at the back of Liliesleaf. From here, activists ran the operations of Umkhonto weSizwe, or MK as it was known.
We did cold sabotage. We tore down telephone lines, we wrecked telephone cables. As we were training ourselves how to reconnoiter, how to approach a target, how to withdraw, how to maintain secrecy.
But the winds of change were blowing through this cottage.
The very buildings you want to destroy, government build, they are guarded at night. If we continue the policy of not taking away life, you are immobilizing us. We can't do anything. So we had to change that decision and say already, although our main aim is not to take life, but where it cannot be avoided, go on with the job.
The High Command wanted to go further. From these Monday nights of heated debate emerged a document laying out plans for an uprising. They called it Operation Maibuye. The idea was to amass 210,000 hand grenades and 48,000 anti-personnel mines. These weapons would be handed out to a guerrilla force of 7,000. An invasion would galvanize these thousands into action. 30 men would land in KwaZulu-Natal, the Northwest Province, the Eastern Cape and the Northern Cape. Each group would split into 3 platoons of 10. moving among the people, causing havoc. The document also called for 300 fighting men to be trained overseas inside 2 months. One of the men, who was in on Operation Maibuye, had just returned from such military training.
We were fresh from China, eager to go into action and fight. So things such as documents, say, leave it to the intellectuals, man. Let them deal. We approved everything. But there were many things later on we realized which were absolutely impossible to put into practice.
Nothing at all. As I said, there was one gun, not as part of Operation Maibuya. That didn't even find a little gun, not even a rifle. That was all there was there. There were these preparations in their mind of Operation Maibuya that we are going to have 7,000 trained people to welcome the first freedom fighters that come into the country. It was all people living on another planet.
I know Kathy's view was negative, and you do have to have a romantic dream of what you can do. The Algerians took on the French army. The French had 1 million soldiers in the field and defeated the French. The Vietnamese fought for 30 years.
There was no harm in trying, as technical officer Dennis Goldberg's job was to arm this phantom army.
I went to a foundryman in an old factory in Joburg to find out if they could make the hand grenade casings for us, give us a head start before before the explosions went off. And I'd made a little sketch of part of the hand grenade casing. And I was going to have part made in one place and part in another and fit them together, so to disguise it all. And I showed him the sketch and said, I need 210,000. Can you make them in 6 weeks? He looked at it and he judged the weight of it. And he said, I think so. You know, we made 15,000 hand grenades a day in World War II. And I nearly fell off my chair.
All the while, the net was tightening. The sabotage riled the authorities. They assembled the best detectives in the country, and they were busy.
It doesn't actually need particular brilliance. It needs system. Now it's done on a computer, but I saw my files, my dossier that they had, like this and this and this. Every meeting I attended, they had a chart with my name and everybody else who'd been there. And you can make patterns. If Dennis is involved, then so-and-so will be involved. If so-and-so is involved, Dennis will be there. On a computer, it's quick now. But they did it by hand. We assumed they couldn't do this kind of thing. We thought we were too clever.
Nelson Mandela was among the first to go, arrested on the road outside Howick in KwaZulu-Natal on August 5, 1962. He was found guilty of instigating strikes and leaving the country illegally for his tour of African nations in search of military training and support. He was sentenced to 5 years. In a countrywide roundup in June 1963, police arrested Elias Motsuledi and searched Soweto for Andrew Mlangeni.
They did not know where I stayed in Dube because they were not accompanied by a local policeman. You see? So they were looking all over the place. There was it was gravel. And Motsuledi said, he doesn't remember how many times they passed there. And Motsuledi is already arrested. In the car, he said, can't this man hear the sound of motor cars passing here and get up if he's at home? He was angry with me that I didn't hear. But I had just arrived before 12 midnight and I immediately fell asleep. I didn't even hear the police when they came. I just heard noise in my bedroom and the torchlight. I'm sleeping with my wife. Torchlight, shining it on my face. When I got up, they said, are you Andrew Mlangeni? We are the police. I said, who are you looking for? They said, are you Andrew Mlangeni? I said, who are you looking for? One of them went to my jacket and found my ID. Look at it, he said, hey, it's him. And then he put this hand on me and said, "You are under arrest." Opstaan, meaning get up. I tell you, Chris, my mouth became dry. It was winter, June the 24th, very cold day. It was June the 24th. My mouth came dry. I said to my wife, "Get me a glass of water, my dear, please." And this policeman says, "You must get permission from us to speak to your wife. You are under arrest." I said, "I must get permission from you to speak to my wife in my house." They said, "You are under detention 90 days.
The arrests made Liliesleaf even more risky, and it was time to move on. The High Command sent Dennis Goldberg to find a new safe house. This he set up at Trevelyan outside Krugersdorp near Johannesburg and drove everyone out to take a look.
On the way there, somebody said, "What shall we call our new place?" And I said, "Let's call it Shufisa." And they said, "Dennis, that sounds like a Xhosa word, but it isn't. What's it mean?" So I said, "It says Supreme Headquarters United Front in South Africa. You know, General Eisenhower had Supreme Headquarters Allied Forces in Europe. So it's Shufisa." Oh, such a laugh, such a laugh. Except for Walter Sisulu, who said, "Comrade, I don't think we've built the United Front yet. That's something we still have to do."
It was agreed there would be one last meeting at Liliesleaf, a decision that would prove costly. The last meeting in the thatched cottage, the early afternoon of July the 11th, 1963.
We had just started this meeting, and we saw this van coming, which was nothing unusual, because there were delivery vans bringing meat or vegetable or bakery or anything, dry cleaning. But we could see from the window. It's only when the back doors opened and we saw these police jumping out with dogs and so forth, as we realized we've been caught. So Sura and I, instinctively, without thinking much, we didn't have time to think, we jumped out of the window towards the road, but we couldn't go a few meters, and the police were there, and they were armed with dogs, and there was no point in now running further. So we were arrested, and the rest of them were arrested in the servants' quarters. Governor Mbeki, Raymond Matlaba, Rusty Bernstein, Bob Heppel, they were still inside.
But I didn't run, I just sat. Some tried to go through the windows and so on. The truth was that I accepted in my mind that I'm now being arrested. And what does it mean to my future? It means I'm going to the gallows. So I just collected myself. I was not prepared to say to a warder, "Good morning, good evening," and so on. I was just non-cooperative, right through.
Nein, mein Name ist Goldberg, Dennis Goldberg.
I just happened to be sitting in the main house at Liliesleaf Farm, and I was tired. I was reading a book. I was actually reading about the first atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Not that I dreamed of making such a thing, it was so horrific. But I was supposed to go and buy a forge so I could practice melting cast iron to make hand grenade casings. Luckily I didn't go. Well, if I had gone, maybe I wouldn't have been arrested. But I know my luck, I would have come back with all this equipment and the judge would have said, "You're not just talking, you're planning, you're actually doing it. So off with your head."
They were so excited that they've got, as they said, they got a jackpot. Because Sisulu was underground, I was underground. They were not expecting Governor Mbeki there. And Raymond Matlaba.
The white people in general considered Mr. Mandela and his colleagues as terrorists, people who wanted to overthrow the government by force and violence, sabotage, treason and sabotage. Whilst, of course, the black people thought completely different. And for them, Mandela was a hero already then.
And suddenly I'm aware there's a guy come in the patio door. And he's in a raincoat and hat, his hands in his pocket, and he's dancing on his feet. There's a cop, and he's obviously got a gun. And I leaped up and grabbed my jacket because I had a notebook where I was going to get the castings made, where I was going to get the woodwork made for our landmines, where I was going to get this, that, and the other. It's an absolute giveaway. So I grabbed my jacket and I ran for the toilet. Damn it, there was a cop between me and the toilet. Couldn't flush anything away.
And the policemen who were guarding us had great sport setting their dogs on us. They had these German wolfhounds. And while we were chained up, handcuffed together, they would incite the dogs to lunge at us and so on.
And I'm the last into the van, and there's a cop with his dog. And I have to sit like this with my legs open, and the dog's got his head between my knees. And I say to the cop, I hope he's well behaved, because I'm feeling very vulnerable sitting there like that. And the cop says something to the dog in a whisper. And the dog's up with his mouth open. I said, it's all right, I believe you, he's under control, thank you.
Goldreich was not there. He drove in a little later and he saw what was happening. He tried to reverse, but it was impossible because the police were all over the show.
And so I drove in, and very carefully, because everything seemed to be too quiet. And then from behind the trees on the way down, special branch people came out, and policemen and so on, and it was like a B-grade movie, hands up.
The Goldreich family was on its way back from picking up Paul Goldreich and his brother Nicholas from a birthday party.
And I used to do is we used to go down.
It had been Terry Hepker's birthday party. Nearly half a century later, the Johannesburg restaurateur walks his sister and daughter through the past. This is his first return to Liliesleaf since his 9th birthday, a day that started so well.
On the day of my birthday was the 11th of July, 63. I had a whole lot of our friends over. We played in the tennis court at home. And at the end of that, we went inside to have tea and the cake. And Nicholas's mom arrived for tea, and she said, would you like to come to us for the weekend? I said, I'd love to. As the light was going down substantially, we arrived at the gate and came down the S-bend of the drive, long drive. And as it straightened out, we stopped the car. And there were hundreds of police here. And Hazel stopped the car and said, good God, what's going on here?
And we were brought down the drive, and it was absolute chaos. It was pandemonium. They were interrogating various people in the house.
And the next day, when we got up, we were very bored because we weren't really doing anything. The police played with us. I had brought a few toys with us, and we threw a boomerang in the garden. The police threw a boomerang of mine that I got for my birthday.
And I also remember things that they said to me during that night. Things like, we're going to hang your father. I told them that there were bombs buried all over the grounds of the farm. And the next day they brought bulldozers to find all of these bombs. Of course, it was rubbish.
Alf Kumwalo saw the raid through his lens. The legendary photographer has spent more than half a century capturing his country's story. On the day he interviewed Muhammad Ali in London for a South African newspaper, Alf received the news he had won a car in a photographic competition. So, a brand new Austin Cambridge was delivered to Soweto. It meant on the day of the raid, Alf was mobile and able to drive to the story of the year.
First of all, I didn't exactly know where Liliesleaf was, but I was given direction, and I got there and I shot pictures. There were police around driving the old Studebaker kind of cars and Ford. Those were the cars police used then. But to disguise, I had an overall that I used to keep in the car, just in case I needed it. And I shot some pictures. At some point I was spotted, but I'd hidden one of the films. They arrested me. I hid one film in the thick grass, but I later fetched it and processed it.
It was the scoop of a lifetime, and Alf and his camera were to follow the story through one of its most dramatic twists. In Britain, in the days after their escape, the urbane Arthur Goldreich and Harold Walpole cut sophisticated figures on the city streets. Here they spoke and raised money for the cause.
It's an oppressive regime. There are all sorts of repressive and racialistic laws which are more than reminiscent of the Nuremberg laws and similar laws which were adopted by the Nazi government.
They baffled many who expected communists with horns growing out of their heads. In the 1960s, large parts of the world feared communism.
Britain, America, the whole of Europe and a host of other countries were scared of them. Or you had the Cold War that lasted until the Berlin Wall came down. So one must return to not only the atmosphere that reigned then and was in vogue at that time. It's very difficult for younger people today who did not live in that time to imagine what was going on. The Americans were very, very much against Soviet encroachment everywhere, what they called Soviet intervention, of which Afghanistan and a host of others were merely examples. You had Soviet leaders making public statements which were interpreted to mean that they would indeed wish to get hold of the oil resources of the world or the mineral resources of the world.
In the 1960s, the South African government set apartheid in stone and its face against communism.
All the major politicians have said, of course, oh yeah, apartheid's terrific, the blacks love it, and the people misunderstand it. They don't realize what we're doing for the blacks, But people like me, everybody else, all the whites knew it, but you see, they didn't admit it. This is the point, it was all hidden away. And then, of course, they tried to put them away in their own homelands and all that kind of thing. That didn't fool anybody either. So they were always propagandizing about apartheid and how good it was for everybody. Well, it wasn't, was it?
And there was a build-up of fear and a demonization of people, that these were violent, desperate, terrible people. It does absolute nonsense. The 50s had the McCarthyism, and it was, they were taking their line from that these communists were absolutely the ruin of everything, of the country, of this fine country.
There was an atmosphere of fear. The police state machinery was so powerful that even within your own family, say you are 5 in the family, you will find that the police have worked on one of your family members to be something of a spy in your family.
They threaten us with guns and point at us with guns and say, if you don't tell us where your father is, we'll shoot you. Or if you do, we'll give you sweets and money. And we never knew where he was, so we wouldn't tell them anything.
The authorities also maintained a tight grip on journalists, according to Ron Anderson, then writing for The Star in Johannesburg.
If there was a march down the middle of town and the police hit people with shambox, you weren't allowed to say that the police were hitting demonstrators with shambox. You could say some men took off their shirts and they had big wheels down the middle of their back, you know, which was quite clear what had happened to them, but you weren't allowed to say that. In the press, restrictions were astonishing. They got to 100 at one time, and we just about held a party. It's like scoring 100 at cricket.
Aside from the restrictions, there was also more sinister manipulation.
The police would also get at the crime reporters too, and they would tell them totally blatant lies. But seeing it's coming from the police, the reporters were inclined to accept, you know, what they were saying is true. And subsequently, it's proved that a lot of it was totally malicious, misleading.
In this atmosphere, gathering the news could be perilous, especially if you happen to be black. This was just one of many assaults on black journalists. This was not a political rally, it was a welcome in Johannesburg for British singer Cliff Richard.
They beat me with the back of the gun, they cracked my skull. And whilst I was in jail, they then decided how they're going to charge me. And I was facing 3 charges, taking pictures of prisoners, resisting arrest and fighting police. Those were my 3 charges. And the case dragged on for a hell of a long time. It was remanded more than 10 times until I started to talk for myself. And then, of course, I had an advocate who's a judge now.
Khumalo was sentenced to 3 years in prison, suspended on condition that he didn't take pictures.
I went out and shot pictures. Defiantly, actually. I was angry. He had sped me on.
To survive required cunning.
It was very difficult because you'd get to a place, even if they know that you're there, they would say, police would watch us and say, nobody's taking pictures, no pictures. We would go away without any pictures, yet we were there. But I found several means of getting pictures. I would sort of clown around and use the self-time exposure, and then put the camera on my head and walk around with a wide-angle lens, totally focused, like I could shoot pictures of all 3 of you, but joking. And then it goes on for 10 seconds. After 10 seconds, the camera clicks, and then I've got my shots. But it put a lot of my colleagues in trouble because we would go back, they don't have pictures, my pictures are published, and the editors want to know why, how come so-and-so's got pictures. So I used to pity them that way.
Kasrada, Kentor, Mandela, Sisulu, Goldberg, Beki, Laba, Motsoaledi, Mlangeni.
Und beim Afrikanischen Nationalkongress
There was small pity from the authorities and a burning desire for even more subtle manipulation. The year after the Rivonia trial, this film was shot in Johannesburg. They called it the Rivonia Process, a reenactment of the raid and the trial. It was made by a German film company, Carrot Films, which still exists but now merely hires out equipment and knows little of its filmmaking history. The South African government, keen to tell its side of the tale, gave policemen with dogs for the filming. Overseeing the shooting was one of the senior detectives from the Rivonia raid. The owner of Carrot Films, Hans Kule, made it clear in a newspaper interview the feeling behind the film. The Rivonia trial was the biggest revelation to the Western world of the devious communist infiltration in free countries.
That's me sitting there.
Gavin Michaelmore was in it. These days, he is a Johannesburg businessman in the hotel industry. In 1965, he was a 19-year-old university student who answered an advertisement for extras. He spent 2 weeks sitting in a courtroom in Johannesburg for a couple of rand a day.
Wow, isn't that fascinating? It's the first time I've seen that. It's the first time I've seen that. Wow.
Sie haben eben gesagt, dass Sie kein Kommunist sind. Wie würden Sie Ihre Einstellung
This was produced and directed so well. You know, the reconstruction here is terrific.
Hat der Staatsanwalt durch Vernehmung von Zeugen und Vorlage der
CNBC Africa found documents held by the German broadcaster ZDF, which oversaw the production. They record a meeting between the producer and the South African foreign minister. It was clear the idea was to show the prisoners in the light that the then government saw them.
The way they were pulled into court and sat down, etc., and the policemen that were either real or actors were doing such a good job of it that you felt that the police were totally in control of this thing, and they were in every way going to see that justice was done from their side of the thing.
Joshua, bleib hier, die bringen dich um!
Los, ihnen nach!
Joshua!
Pass auf!
There were also blatant inaccuracies like this late-night shootout that never happened.
Pass auf, die Seite, komm! Hierher!
This character was supposed to be Nelson Mandela. This was meant to be the prosecutor, Percy Utah, played by the director Jürgen Goslar, looking more Hollywood than the deputy prosecutor of the Transvaal. Ironically, when the film was finished, it was banned. It was called anti-South African and refused an import permit. It took a 2-year battle for it to be shown. First, it had to be shown to the generals and police. They gave the go-ahead provided there were cuts. Off went 14 minutes of the famous Mandela speech from the doc. The Sunday Express reported, legal opinion is that Mandela's speech cannot be quoted since he is a banned person.
I mean, it's laughable, isn't it?
This is just one reason why members of the families connected with the Rivonia trial are sceptical about the film.
It's a great double of my father, this.
Paul Goldreich's father was arrested at Liliesleaf. This was his first visit since that day nearly half a century ago. This was also his first glimpse of the German film. To his surprise, he saw he'd been given pigtails.
Why they would switch a boy for a girl, I don't know. My mother and father clearly characterised completely incorrectly. But also, the interesting thing to me was the insinuation of the construction of the farm and the lookouts, and everything is hammed up really, and obviously to show that this was a penny and dime outfit.
In keinem Land für einen Guerillakrieg so günstig wie für uns hier in Südafrika.
I think it's very interesting as a propaganda film because I think if you look at the characterization, I think there's a real split in it between the white characterization and the black characterization. The black men are seen to be rather dull and stupid. The whites are seen to be rather dour and intense. Where they got the characters from, God only knows, because they're completely and utterly wrong. But also, I think it's a fascinating piece of film. I think it should be analysed, really.
The other side had its propaganda too, in a war for the hearts and minds of the people that rages until this day. For decades, the hearts and minds of South Africans have been a battleground in the fight to harness the will of the people. The nationalist government had its propaganda and it spread far and wide, according to Harold Wolpe's widow, Anne-Marie Wolpe, now retired in Cape Town after a lifetime of exile in Europe.
In London, in the 80s, I think, 2 young South Africans moved in across the street from us. And when one day this young woman walked in to the house and she saw Joe Slovo, she turned grey, walked away, and said afterwards to me, "That man is planning to kill our children."
The activists had their propaganda too. On the streets of South Africa, hard-working photographers like Alf Kumwalo were right in amongst it.
Yeah. It wasn't actually propaganda because it was true. They used things that were actually truthful. I mean, there were so many killings, so many things that were happening that it was bad enough without any lie. You didn't even have to lie. You just had to present what had happened. And in places like the US, for instance, South Africa would have somebody who would stand up and say, people are living very well in South Africa, etc., etc. Now, a guy like Dumisani Khumalo, who was down there, we used to feed them with facts, with real information. They would stand up against people like Berg Brothers. No, the situation is not like that. The situation is this way and that way. So South Africa used propaganda big time. When it was just words, the outer world didn't believe that South Africans were suffering. So the images carried by newspapers were the ones that got our freedom, got the outside world to rally to our support.
This support helped pave the way to a democratic South Africa. A daily reminder for the small team preserving the memory of Liliesleaf and the Rivonia trial at this historical site. For them, in the 21st century, it's still a struggle for hearts and minds. It's a different struggle. Now it's for the attention and money of an ever more discerning and demanding public. Keeping up to date is a never-ending task. Adrian van den Heerfer has been working on the project for more than 4 years and feels change is good.
I mean, in terms of content, it gives you, and ongoing research, it allows you far more scope because you are able to update content far more quicker than if you're dealing with static exhibits. But I think it allows you, the fact that you've got to have bells and whistles and things that move, it immediately plugs into where South Africa and the world's population is at the moment.
Each exhibit has to strive for the latest technology. It's no longer enough to read the information, it has to come alive.
The technology used in this table is fairly unique in that we are using Nintendo Wii Remote technology up in the ceiling in almost in a reverse fashion to the way they'd normally be used in everyday life. So we really have 2 Nintendo Wii Remotes up in the ceiling that are tracking the movement of these orbs. They are then communicating that position information back to a computer via Bluetooth, which then calls up the flash-driven graphical information. That information is then projected via 2 very high-resolution short-throw projectors onto the table via mirrors, and that allows us to create a workspace which acts much like a big touchscreen. So instead of it actually being touch active, we are using these orbs to create the movement and the touch points. Development of concept and development of the technology, the back-end software being the biggest challenge, took in the region of 9 months, and then about another 3 months of trimming the visual interface.
This is the latest updated exhibit.
Well, this has proved to be quite a cheeky exhibit. Is that through the development, the research that was undertaken over a process between 2 and 3 years, we started amassing really curious stories that aren't mainstream history. It's not necessarily about, you know, the key elements and essence of Liliesleaf, but they're part and parcel of the Liliesleaf story. And we thought, we needed to somehow house them in an exhibit. We're busy with the installation of the top part of our cabinet, which tells five key stories. The one relates to the notion of surveillance. Across the road in the 1960s, there was originally the Rivonia caravan park, and one of the ladies that lived in the Rivonia caravan park, Mary Russell, who was an avid bird watcher, used to watch through her binoculars, watch the goings on of the birds, and through her binoculars she saw that there were these curious post office workers on the top of these telephone masts who would be there the whole day, but they were armed with binoculars and they were looking at Liliesleaf in the distance. So this section that's at the moment, this big cavity, is really about the story of bird watching and possible surveillance that was happening from the caravan park. A lone caravan that Dennis Goldberg, who was actually captured in this room at the time of the raid, how he recalls this strange, peculiar lone caravan parked. And it's really those stories that show the everyday, day-to-day life, and it gives an essence of what Rivonia was all about at the particular time. Then on the other side of the cabinet, an animation which deals with 4 key stories. Also during our research phase, we kept on there were a number of people that have referred to a secret wine cellar being in the house, and to date none of us have ever found it. So it's really about this idea of a wine cellar. Radio freedom that the police believed was broadcast from, and led the media to believe was broadcast from Liliesleaf, which in actual fact wasn't true. A buried Makarov pistol, which the media has also picked up on, that Nelson Mandela had buried in some place in some location on the farm, and Cecil Williams, who took Nelson Mandela down to Groutville to brief Chief Albert Lutuli, and on their way back they were both captured, and that led to Nelson Mandela's arrest. But there's an interesting reference to a revolver which he had concealed in the seat, the upholstery of the seat, which has never been found. What's really exciting is that, as you can see on the animation, is the footprint of the historic structures at Liliesleaf, the main house, the outbuildings, and the chicken coops. So on top of this whole screen is a 3-dimensional model that is placed on top of it. So you start playing with the idea of the digital world which we engage with every day, and the idea of little models, and it just becomes quite a special and visually evocative exhibit.
In the next episode, we look into the pride and passion of the Rivonia trial, the hearing in this courtroom that turned Nelson Mandela from a prisoner serving a sentence to a name known in every corner of the globe.
He would have sat here, because this is where the accused normally sit.
In this cell he lingered, a cell where a defiant pen scrawled the Freedom Charter. The writing was indeed on the wall for the apartheid regime. The Rivonia trial was to prove the beginning of the end.